And for more on Indonesia Airlines and others in the region, I'm joined by Phil Derner, live from our NASDAQ studios. He is the president and founder of NYC-Aviation. Thanks so much for joining us, Phil. Tell us more about this blacklist. How does an airline get off of it? And does being on the list have a negative economic impact on an airline?
Well, the blacklist itself is something that, and if you look at the list, you'll see that these are, for the most part, nations and not so much airlines. A lot of it has to do with regulatory issues, making sure that these nations have some sort of administration or agency that can properly oversee the operation of these airlines. Getting on it is, of course, a bad PR move for any airline, and it's going to be difficult also for people in that nation to really know that these folks might be on a blacklist. Folks in the European Union, of course, are aware and won't have that option, but information and in a lot of these poorer nations as well, there aren't even many options for their population to be able to go and choose other airlines, so they're going to fly them anyway. So it is very difficult for people to be able to fly on these airlines that are considered unsafe elsewhere in the world, but in their nations, it might not even hurt that airline too much.
Well, there are reports that this particular AirAsia flight was flying without a proper permit or even had permission to fly that particular route that day. And if that's found to be the case, who is more responsible for this crash, the airline or those who allowed it to fly?
Well, we don't really know exactly what caused this particular crash yet. As far as the permit for them to operate, that's totally a regulatory issue. The airline does have some part in that, but even if the airline wanted to operate, there should have been something in place to be able to stop that aircraft from ever taking off. That portion of it, which may have had nothing at all to do with the crash itself, but that is a major regulatory issue and could be indicative of a larger problem in that area in their aviation industry.
So speaking of safety regulations, why are they so different and varied around the world? Do you ever see that changing, or a time when various entities can come together and come up with one comprehensive set of regulations?
Well, there are some international aviation organizations that try to spread some regulation and normalcy and safety throughout the world, but it is very difficult for a lot of poorer countries or countries that just in general have a weaker infrastructure or a difficult time economically for whatever their individual issues are to be able to develop a strong organization that can not only create this regulation, but then also enforce it, to be able to investigate crashes, to figure out their causes, and to learn from that to make it safer and safer, as we see here in the United States, for example.
Well, as we saw in our earlier report, and we talked about the blacklist, 62 of Indonesia's airlines are on this blacklist, as we mentioned. Malaysia Airlines had 2 crashes just last year. There's been a lot of issues with Lion Airlines in Indonesia. What is your advice or suggestion to investors in the region, investors in these various airlines in Asia?
Well, I think that investing in the airline industry is challenging enough, even in better environments and stronger environments here in the United States. It tends to be a losing profit. They are very high stakes anywhere. When you're in some of these other nations, you just really need to pick and choose and really examine which airlines might be limited by challenges that, again, regulatory perspectives. Do they have a strong aviation administration that's going to be overseeing this airline to make sure that they're going to be operating safe, so that they're not going to have to deal with some of these other challenges, which you just don't see in other nations? It just requires a watchful and cautious eye.
Talk about the growth in that region. Airline travel, the industry has grown exponentially in recent years. The Wall Street Journal recently had a report about a lack of experienced pilots and pilot training in Asia. So with that said, are accidents and crashes inevitable with large growth?
Well, training is probably the #1 safety issue anywhere in the world. You want to have flight crews that are very, very well trained and can handle any type of situation no matter what comes up. And that's very costly. It's very time consuming. It's natural for businesses who maybe haven't been in the airline industry as long as people in the United States, here in the US. I mean, it's been over a century now operating in commercial aviation. Some of these other nations don't have as much experience. So one would hope that they look beyond their borders to see what they can learn, how they can adapt. And again, it comes down to money. It's extremely expensive to be able to train all these flight crews, to maintain these aircraft. It's difficult for airlines here in the United States and in Europe to be able to make a profit with all of the challenges in order to keep it safe. They do a wonderful job of keeping everyone safe around here. And it's just that much more of a challenge. Economically, there are a ton of factors that make it very difficult. Training is #1. Then there are many, many airlines in that part of the world that do an excellent job of it, even exceeding the minimum requirements by their federal regulators.
All right, Phil Derner in New York, thank you so much for your time and perspective.
Thank you very much.